So the first topic we want to talk about is all the breaches that have been happening, and there's been a lot of them. We've had Anthem, we've had the one up just north of us at Primera. We've had a number of them. So what do you guys think about these breaches? What are your thoughts? Who wants to start?
I will. So, I mean, there's been quite a few high-profile breaches over the last year, frankly, but even the last quarter, we were seeing a concentration of healthcare providers and entities in the healthcare space being breached. And the big takeaway for me is that it's demonstrative that the crimeware community is now targeting protected healthcare information. Something we talked about in the past, that the actual value of this data has increased beyond most other easily compromised data types. But this is tangible evidence, I think, to that fact.
During our hacking HIPAA presentation a couple months back, we talked about the fact that the average stolen credit card is worth about $5. The average stolen healthcare record is worth anywhere from $20 to $40. And to criminals, it's the gift that keeps on giving, because it can also be used for ongoing identity theft and such. So the value of that data is extremely high, and they're targeting it very hard. There's even been some articles in things like the New York Times recently about this, so it's getting some mainstream attention as well.
Well, I think the idea is so much attention was put on people having credit cards stolen for so long that there's an infrastructure in place to replace those numbers, mitigate the damage, keep people from having to pay more than $50 per breach. But you can't change your healthcare information or your identity so easily. So it's a more valuable target, just like you said.
Well, and it's also probably seemed to be more vulnerable. People have been paying attention to protecting credit card data for a long time now. And so there's infrastructures in place. People are paying attention to that. Protected healthcare information, although you've had HIPAA in place, it really hasn't been a requirement. It hasn't been regulated and enforced. And so it looks as if the criminal element is taking the path of least resistance.
Well, I think one of the great things that HIPAA did too was provide for and make it necessary that healthcare information was more easily interchangeable between insurance companies and hospitals. But the side effect of that is so many healthcare organizations are now so much more invested in technology and have so much more information sitting there. There's just more to target than there is with a traditional business that has a handful of information systems that talk to each other, right? I mean, most hospitals have hundreds, not 5 or 10.
James, you had an interesting point you brought up when we were sitting here earlier. You got some information on one of the most recent breaches that I thought was really fascinating. You want to share that with everybody? I think that is very useful information.
Yeah, it was with regards to the Anthem breach. The hackers actually used a phishing campaign to obtain only five credentials, and that's how they were able to exfiltrate all of that data. Anthem has 37,000 employees, but they only needed 5 passwords to do that with.
That's pretty remarkable. You think about it.
Yeah. I mean, it just shows that it really only takes one little chink in the armor for somebody to get the foothold there and get through.
Well, it reinforces the idea that defense in depth is necessary.
Sure.
You can't just protect the edge, and you can't just educate your users about security. You have to do those things, but you also need other controls in place to help protect the systems if a breach does occur.
Yeah, I would speculate that they have a reasonably mature security awareness program if it was so few of their employees that actually fell for the phishing attack, unless it was only sent out to a few. But presumably, based on the size of that organization, they probably had also a reasonably mature HIPAA compliance program in general. But the fact is, security awareness, you're never going to eliminate the risk entirely. And if you don't have good defense in depth to contain the inevitable, that's when the problems start to.
If there's one thing that we've learned in the last 15 years since the I love you virus, it's that no matter how much training and awareness you do, you will always have some percentage of your employees that are going to click on that thing.
Right.
Sure.
There's always going to be 5 out of 37,000. I mean, most companies with a lot less than 37,000 employees have 5 who would click on that thing.
Yeah, I'm surprised it was only 5 and not 50 or 500. So.
Well, it also shows that when you're planning these kinds of systems and planning what controls and what you want to do for your security architecture in general, that all it takes is one. That's an important thing to realize, is that one set of compromised passwords could compromise, or credentials anyway, provide access to anything.
Okay, so, I'm executive guy and I say, great, what are we going to do about this? I mean, so what, what's the answer to this? I mean, it seems, I'll tell you what a lot of executives say when I talk to them. They're like, what am I going to do about this? I mean, how can I stop this? This seems like an unstoppable force at this point, like the east wind. It's nothing will prevent it from permeating and taking over. So what do we do about it?
Amazingly enough, even today, a lot of the places that we go visit, we still see a lack of in-depth security, a lack of security operations. They still hand it off to the system admins and the IT directors and the IT managers and say, go do security. And, they're doing the best they can, but it's a pretty complicated area. And unless you've got experience, unless you've got the skill set to do it, and keep in mind, you're still trying to keep IT operations running as well. It's a pretty tough job to get it all done at the same time, and the idea that you're going to drop one ball out of the 7 or 8 you're juggling, it's not unreasonable to think it's going to happen.
And we go into a place that doesn't necessarily have as mature a security program yet. And what's the first thing we tell them to do? Inventory your assets. Know where the data is. You can't protect it if you don't know where it is. And I think that's one of the first things to discuss with executive leadership at an organization, saying, look, do you know what data lives on the most vulnerable machines in your enterprise, the actual desktops that your people use? If there's not a need for it to be there, it shouldn't be there in the first place, right?
I think the root cause here, really, a lot of the places we work with that recognize they may have challenges protecting healthcare data to the rigor that they would like to, is that they're resource constrained. To your point, security operations, defense in depth, easier said than done if you are short on manpower and you're just focused on the availability aspect of IT services. To be able to spend the time to maintain confidential integrity of this data. You're just going to have to set that aside if your focus and your charter is to keep the network running. And so my answer to the executives would be, let me make it clear to you what the actual risk to our organization is by not allocating more resources to this, be it more manpower or whatever. And I'm not necessarily suggesting just throw a bunch of technology at the problem, but a holistic approach that's going to require a little bit more attention. But you're not going to get that buy-in without being able to effectively communicate the risk that the organization is facing.
Well, and I also think the focus, in the past has always been availability. IT 5 nines, keep it running. And the landscape has changed. Now you've got to worry about confidentiality as well and the integrity of the data. So, the picture has increased, but we haven't really increased the IT infrastructure to support that bigger scope of work.
Let's talk for a moment about communicating risk to the executive level and to the board.
I like that topic.
So Jack and I attended the Enterprise Risk Management Forum here recently in Portland.
Right, yeah.
That was the inaugural event for this. They're planning on doing it regularly.
Symposium here in Portland.
Yeah, the symposium. It was the Enterprise Risk Management Symposium was aimed at the C-suite and board level people. There were a lot of discussions about that, and there was an IT breakout during the course of the day. But one of the things that came up was that people were talking about the fact that IT risk is starting to get a lot more attention than it has in the past. Like, IT risk, to a large extent, has always previously been sort of rolled up into general operational risk, and there's always been the assumption from the board level that if somebody's looking after this, someone's taking care of IT risk, and it's just getting incorporated into our other risks, and we don't need to examine that specifically. They were saying that these days, with all of the very high-profile breaches and the huge amounts of monetary loss that companies are experiencing, people are starting to realize that an IT breach could potentially cost you the company. And so they're actually talking about changing the COSO model, which is one of the very commonly used risk models for this. And they're talking about changing the COSO infrastructure and making IT risk one of the top level categories that gets communicated directly to the board.
So what you're saying is IT management is going to need to be prepared to be able to communicate risk at the board level, whether they're prepared or not.
Yes.
There was actually talk about bringing senior IT into the board level meetings to explain what's going on and to make presentations at the board level, which is a pretty good change.
Oh, it's a fantastic opportunity to get the buy-in that's required to be able to do the job effectively beyond the availability piece, as you mentioned.
Well, it brings up a really good point, too, that technology security is not just an IT function. It's a function of risk management. right? So it should be integrated with whatever overall risk management program or
Corporate risk
coverage.
management.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Business risk, not just risk to the devices themselves, right?
Sure.
We're talking about the information that lives on them.
Yep. But that recognition that they've got now that, your IT risk can be so significant that all by itself, IT could cost you the whole business, has become a thing that has suddenly bubbled up into people's awareness. So
Talking about the threats, though, to these different enterprises, and specifically looking at some of these breaches, the phishing instance, I think, was definitely notable because it does underscore some challenges of security awareness. But the other part, one of the other breaches that I thought was pretty interesting was I believe it was Primera. The root cause was from a third-party service provider was compromised.
It was Anthem. Was it Anthem? Doesn't matter.
And so the bottom line is that was the vector to get into the organization. And I think, in my perspective, that's a really easily overlooked threat.
So they got into Target. Too.
Yeah, that wasn't the Primera one. That was a smaller breach for Advantage Dental. Still somebody targeting PHI, but it was a third-party service provider. And so the idea, I think, that you're really bringing up here is third-party trust is something that needs to be addressed as well. How do you ensure that the people you're doing business with are holding themselves to the same standards you are, right?
one of the things that I have seen in doing some of our risk reviews is that, especially in places that need to be HIPAA compliant, there's a lot of trust put in contracts without technical controls to support them.
Oh, you've got a business associate agreement. You're cool.
Exactly. Hey, look, it says right there that they have to treat our data as confidential. And I look and I see that there are no technical controls to enforce any of this, and that in fact all kinds of third-party providers who have no business at all being able to access large volumes of PHI are able to do so, and they've only got a contract that says that they're not going to do it.
It's interesting you bring that up because it's sort of a lesson of business that I don't think a lot of security people and IT people always understand, that contracts are not reality. Reality is reality. Contracts are supposed to somewhat reflect reality, but they're not reality. And just because you have a contract, that kind of doesn't mean anything. That's like, okay, great. So what?
Well, tell Advantage Dental that, because what you're hearing on the news is Advantage Dental, not whoever this third party was. So, they're naming the contract all they want, but they're not the ones who are taking the hit on the reputation.
Which is another good point. Reality is reality. Contracts are not reality.
Yeah. Well, HIPAA and PCI both require, that you have these agreements with third-party service providers or anybody you exchange information with. But to your point about the business lesson, you still have to do the due diligence to make sure that they didn't just sign the contract, they actually do the things that it requires them to do.
Yeah, well, this gets into...
It's interesting you mentioned the word due diligence, because lately I've been involved in a lot of acquisitions that have been going on, which you guys know about because I haven't been around very much. But what's interesting in watching these transactions, right, where literally billions of dollars are going to transact, man, they sure as heck want to get lots of different perspectives and insights and due diligence. I mean, they want to pick these companies apart, and that makes sense. I mean, when you're talking billions of dollars at stake, but when you translate this sort of concept over to IT security, there's other things. It's amazing how little diligence is done. They send out these questionnaires, which, I mean, oh yeah, check, good to go,
We've got a firewall, we're fine, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So we're fine. Right?
A lot of this, I think, comes down to not having a great understanding of risk management, though. If you talk about contractual obligations, business associate agreements, even something like breach insurance, okay, you might be transferring some of the liability of a breach, but you're not transferring any of the headline risk, right?
Oh, yeah.
The reputational risk could be the real killer here, and the best way to try to mitigate that is try to actually have some level of due diligence performed on whoever these third parties are that you're trusting. And I'm actually hopeful that with some of the new improvements here to HIPAA in the omnibus, that some of the entities are going to start asking of their business associates to be able to demonstrate their compliance with HIPAA beyond just signing the BAA.
I think the one-liner takeaway from that one is there is no way to transfer reputational risk.
Right. You get breached, and you may
Good way to
have,
put it.
it's still your name that winds up on the news or on, Twitter or social media and that kind of stuff these days. And that's one of the other problems is older companies used to be able to, have a breach, it'd wind up on the newspaper, CNN or whatever, and then a couple of days later things would shift. But these days the information gets out there so much faster than most companies are prepared for. The PR guys weren't expecting the need to show up to work this morning and have to respond to a breach that nobody knew about except for.
The only thing I would say is I think there is a sort of, you're getting sort of breach fatigue in the world, which is sort of like, yeah, another breach, whoop-de-doo, I mean, who cares? And the public is certainly feeling that. I mean, we're all to the point now where you get a new credit card, you're like, yeah, right. Deal.
But let's talk about healthcare breaches, though. Those are going to be different because you lose your credit card. They issue you a new credit card. You have to change your online. You have to go and log into Amazon, change what credit card you're using, that kind of thing. You lose your healthcare data, that's going to pursue you for the rest of your life.
Yeah,
and
your
the more
identity
people
gets
that
compromised.
happens to, the more angry people are going to get and start demanding that their legislators do something about it.
You can't change your identity. It's easy.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
That's the whole thing. That's what we talked about, the value of this data. It's non-revocable or certainly not as easily.
Yeah, but translate it back around the other way. Look at it from the perspective of the people that it affects. Once that starts to affect enough of the population, once enough people have been hit with this and they start getting this ongoing identity theft going that's going to hurt them and pursue them forever, they're going to start demanding that government do something about this.
Well, even reputational risk, right? We talked about this. I don't no longer shop at Target or Home Depot necessarily because my card might have got reissued as a result of that breach. Because at the end of the day, the liability to me as a consumer is nil. But if Anthem was my insurance provider and I ended up having some type of massive case of identity theft as a result of that breach, I would probably have serious reservations about ever using them as a provider again.
Right.
Because the impact on me would have been so much more severe.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So somebody asked the question of how can we impress on healthcare workers the significance of this threat? Well, there you kind of have it. Well, I think we just answered that question. I think the revocability issue is probably one of the better ones to talk about, that you can't revoke somebody's identity. And that's something that I think even pretty much anybody can understand. But
so I think the easiest way to impress upon healthcare workers how important it is to treat PHI appropriately is to remind them that in most healthcare organizations, especially for healthcare providers, hospital systems, clinic networks, that kind of stuff, those employees are almost always also patients. It's not just some customers' data, it's their data too.
That's a great point. And
that is a very good point.
I think just the general concept of trust is also very important. I don't really care necessarily if I can trust my retailer. If they've got the cheap, paper towels or whatever, and it's close to my house, then I'm probably going to go there because my liability as well. But I definitely need to trust my healthcare providers. That's very important. And trust can be eroded very easily. And even if it's some type of breach, that's going to erode my trust in the organization overall, be it their ability to provide healthcare or protect my data.
Well, and the stakes are so much higher that if trust gets eroded with one healthcare organization, I mean, you hear patients had a bad experience at one hospital and now they'll never go to another organization that's part of that network again. You have a bad experience at Providence or Multicare, Legacy or whatever, and you're not going to go back to any of their places. You're going to find alternatives.
You don't want to take a lot of chances with your life at the end of the day, right? So.
Right. Nobody cares about you quite like you care about you.
Which is one of the most important tools you can use to get people caring about security. Right?
And your point about them also being a client of where they work is a good one.
Yeah,
healthcare workers.
So I think that's another dimension to answering that question. So let's move on to the next topic. So recent vulnerabilities. One of the questions that was asked was to discuss the recent GitHub attack, which we can mention. Although that's more of an attack, not necessarily a vulnerability. But then there's been some pretty big vulnerabilities around, of course, SSL and TLS seem like they get hacked every week these days. There's the GLib, the NTP. The NTP one was fascinating. I wasn't even aware of that one until you guys kind of told me about it. I mean, again, I hear a lot of executives say, what are we going to do about this? It seems inevitable. Now we have these sort of massive, widespread, shell shock style breaches that are just everywhere. What do we do about it?
I think there's a couple of things, and even the GitHub issue is a good example of this as well, is that we have to be generally mindful of the fact that we can't assume that all of the underlying services and protocols that we're using, particularly these open source ones, are necessarily appropriately vetted, secured, protected, maintained. I think we need to be aware of the high dependency that so much of our infrastructure has on some of these open source solutions. NTP, for example, with this one guy that basically is maintaining it, has finally said, I've had enough. And I almost hesitate to bring up that issue because, to your point, I could see a real exacerbated, so what? What are you telling me here? The whole internet's dependent on a few guys and a few poorly maintained protocols that I have no control over.
Yes.
Yeah, that's yeah, pretty much.
But the point is, what can you do about it, right? And so
I think that, the thing, those executives don't know that. You talk to executives, they think there's always this big, massive corporate machine with, big accountants and lawyers and guys in suits, and it's all part of this grand, massive, infrastructure of greatness, and they don't realize sometimes that it literally boils down to some ponytailed guy in his bathrobe running the whole flipping thing.
As a volunteer.
As a volunteer, and they just don't comprehend that. They're like, what do you mean it all boils down to this guy? Yeah, it all boils down to this guy. That's pretty much it.
Well, I think, one of the ideas really is getting past the point of software is not just a fire and forget kind of thing. You don't set it up, install it, and go. It's a machine. It's not necessarily a tangible machine, but it's a machine, and you have to maintain it over time. Somebody's got to actually change the oil and change the plugs and all that other kind of stuff that you would do to any other machine you got to take care of.
Yeah. Question, how long have we been telling people that security is an ongoing process, not an endpoint that you can simply achieve, wash your hands of, and walk away?
Forever, eventually.
Forever, but you know what? You know why nobody hears that? And I'm gonna expose one of my deep scars that I have. It's because every technology vendor goes out and says, buy this, click it on, you're good to go. You're good to go. Just buy. Buy. They're always selling that next shiny object that is just going to take away all your pain and problems and resolve everything. And it's always nonsense. We know that. That's why we got out of that business.
So, a lot of that comes back down to, though, challenges with security operations is what we're really saying here, to maintain the infrastructure. And I think all of these breaches are a good example. Yes, it's very likely that there's going to be another big headline or vulnerability, rather, that it was some zero-day attack. There was nothing you could have done to prevent this necessarily. But where the lack of due diligence comes into play is if the team that is responsible for maintaining the infrastructure does not have the resources to have a good vulnerability management program, to be aware immediately when one of these new vulnerabilities gets disclosed and be able to quickly identify all the key systems that are susceptible to it, to implement the workarounds that are necessary, to increase the monitoring, whatever would be warranted from a general security operations perspective, because you're too resource constrained to even have an infrastructure in place. That's where the due diligence really falls down.
Well, and quickly identifying what you need to fix, it goes back to the point I mentioned earlier about, one of the first things we tell organizations that they need to do if they don't have it is to inventory all their assets.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't have the resources to manage, to deal with security operations on an ongoing basis, how do you respond to an emergent event if you don't even know what it is you need to fix?
Yep.
And I think a lot of that comes back to your point, Andrew, about if you're not effectively communicating the risk to the executives, that, it really does come down to just this one dude, in Medford that maintains NTP. And if that goes south, we have no ability to do legitimate instant response because our clock skews are all off.
Right.
And what does that really mean without having that big technical explanation? You're not going to get the buy-in you need to actually improve your security posture and do your due diligence.
And I won't get too much on this because it's a little off topic for security, but we also, some of the bigger companies that depend so much on these protocols that are maintained by, 1, 2, 3 people or whatever, we also need to take the time to appreciate these people and help them do what it is that we depend on. NTP is a perfect example just because it's really one guy that's doing all of this work. Well, so much depends on it. We can't just say, thank you very much and hope he just continues to do it for the rest of his life.
And that's the case. This guy has said this, that he works with some of these big companies to implement their specifications and everything. He's like, how about a little help here? Like, nope, sorry.
It's like, thanks very much, but no, we're not.
We're not going to actually pay for your expertise.
But that is a more complicated solution, having a consortium of, big tech companies or NIST or whatever taking over these protocols.
Why won't they pay, I probably shouldn't say this, but why won't they pay him, but they'll hand over millions of dollars to big technology companies who produce, frankly, stuff that doesn't work? Is it just because they have better marketing departments or something? Is that the long and short of it? If Father Time here had a better marketing department, he could make it. And I don't know. Maybe I'm just ruminating here. So
sure. Well, and it's not. We mentioned NTP a lot, but it's not just NTP. The first couple of real problems that were exposed with the SSL protocols came down to the same thing. That was 2 guys.
Yeah.
you know, and responsible for all this kind of stuff.
2 guys 13 years ago.
Right.
Right.
But remember,
Oh,
I
yeah.
think that some of these are so old, but I think the takeaway really for organizations is not to get so frustrated at the fact that there are some of these really systemic weaknesses that we've identified or have been identified over the course of the last couple of months, but what can you do about it? And I think that really comes down to having these effective vulnerability management programs, good security operations.
And back to that thing about, you know, like security is something where you come into the office every day and you keep doing
Every
security.
day.
It's not something where you ever finish it and walk away and go, oh my God, thank God we're done with that. You know?
Right.
Exactly.
Well, going back to the executive perspective a little bit, maybe one of the issues is that so many of these companies have come in and said, buy our technology, throw the switch, and everything will be okay, that executive leadership has no idea how complex their actual IT, not just IT security, is, and how much actual management structure is necessary to make it work, right?
It's the total cost of ownership. This gets back to the whole vendor thing, which, you know, is not the focus of this discussion, of course, but at the end of the day, I've never heard a sales pitch for some, you know, security appliance that mentioned the total cost of ownership to actually run it and make it effective.
Oh, buy
No,
this
because
today and you're going to be paying for it the rest of the time
Yeah.
you're in
Yeah,
business.
and forget about the licenses and talk. I'm talking about the fact that for it to realize the promises I just made, you're going to need 3 full-time guys
Forever.
forever, right?
Because they never sell anything. I mean, you know, if that ever actually happened, people go, oh, wait a minute, why should I buy this? Well, yeah, why should you buy it?
Well, and how many members of executive leadership or even just operational managers understand that buying some of those products also means acquiring increasing a resource, you know, buying an individual
exactly.
to manage it. It's
Why-
not just the technology.
Why do you
it's
think
what
they
it
started
takes to deal
marketing
with
them as solutions instead of tools? A tool sounds like something that you
Well,
need a
somebody's gotta
worker
work
to
a tool,
use.
right.
A solution sounds like something that you just plug in and it
Fixes
fixes
the
it.
problem, right?
Right.
But there are solutions to the problem of the organization sitting there saying, well, I can't afford a 6-figure appliance and 3 guys to run it. You know, the cloud, which everybody has their own personal feelings on, there are certainly services available in the cloud that you could be outsourcing this from a tool perspective, from a operations perspective, the various MSPs that are out there. So,
Well, that's true, because if you're a large company, you know, you can absorb some of that overhead. It's expected. You can afford that. If you're on some of the smaller companies, you're on a tighter budget, you're not going to be able to go out and hire a security guy or 3 or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, you're going to have to figure out ways to be inventive, and you know, outsourcing to a security service may be an answer for you.
Well, and going back to that contract discussion we had earlier, the bigger companies, those smaller companies might want to work with, expect those smaller companies have the same at least dedication and perspective on management security that way. They may not have the resources, but the larger companies assume that they do, right? Or assume at least that they're paying as close attention to it.
sure.
I think we should also, it is worth noting, even though we may all sound really negative on security technologies, the fact is they are sort of a necessary evil, and that they are important. And they're also evolving and getting better. There are a lot of really great technologies out there. But again, it kind of, I think what we're saying and what executives need to hear is, and I say this all the time when I meet with executives, which it really doesn't matter which tool you pick. At the end of the day, it kind of, you can pretty much flip a coin and just pick a tool and go with whatever name you like. It's way more about the people who are running that tool
In the process.
and the
Yeah.
process you have.
The tools are to help you execute your security process.
Right.
But they're tools. Tools
They're
break,
tools.
and tools need to be taken care of.
Yep.
Yep. No, it's true.
So, and I know that a lot of executives get frustrated because then they ask a question, and I've heard this from leadership that I've talked to. It's like they feel like when they ask a question, they don't get an answer. They get a, well, you know, there's the, you know, glib, they get all this tech talk, and they're like, look, I don't want to hear, you know, the intricate binary details of why, you know, this line of code, I don't get it and I don't understand that. You know, can you boil this down into something that makes sense to us? And I think a lot of security people, they get too kind of lost in sort of the nitty gritty, you know, all the various millions of attack tactics, and they miss sort of the key message of, you know, We need people, we need processes.
And why? What could happen
Yeah.
to us?
Yeah, and why?
Right.
What's the threat? What's how?
Yeah.
And if you're having a board level discussion and you say the word glibc, you've already,
Yeah.
it's over.
That's
So-
all the eyes ablaze.
A message for all of you out there. If you say glibc to your
Well,
board,
yeah.
Here's the other thing.
fail.
Here's the other thing. When they start escalating IT specific issues to the board, one of the good things that's liable to come out of this is that it's liable to empower a lot of IT security departments who have spent a lot of times beating their heads against the wall. Because the truth is that IT security is very often asking people to do things that they don't want to do.
That's
They're
right.
asking for downtime in order to do maintenance on things and to apply patches. They're asking for people to cooperate in terms of architecting their things in a secure manner. They're asking for cooperation in terms of, security ops and all this kind of thing, and all stuff that a lot of people think of as impeding their business or slowing down their delivery and stuff like that. So, I mean, IT security often has a little bit of a difficult time getting a foothold. And having this stuff escalated up to the board level and having attention paid to this stuff is liable to result in IT security getting a boost in their own company and being better enabled to do the job that they need to do.
Well, what it means is that in order for an IT security organization to be able to effectively conduct their operations and get the board sponsorship they need to innovate
They
and
need-
upgrade and all that kind of stuff, they need not just technical training. They need to know how to talk to business people, not
Yes.
tech people.
They need a champion.
communication skills. They need
Right.
PR skills. They need,
Yeah.
The most effective CISOs and stuff that we work with, their main job is to socialize their mission of how they can be there to enable the business. It's not to select which vendor they're going to buy.
It's to advocate security.
It's to advocate and
Start
so
with why.
Yeah.
What you're talking about is start with why, which is something I talk about in a lot of my presentations. This idea of the only way you're ever really going to get an organization to do anything is to have a why, a reason behind why you do things. And that you have to kind of keep playing that card over and over and over and over and over again to use that as the motivator to get people on board. Because, like we said, if you mention glibc, people are just going to, they don't care. I don't get it. So that's a problem I think a lot of people don't understand about people in executive sort of positions. If they don't understand you, they think what you're saying is useless. A lot of executives, like it or not, that's the way they think about things. I don't get it, so it must be useless. The only things that I want to spend money on are things that I understand and that I get.
Well, traditionally from the board level, IT has just been this thing that enables the business to run.
Right.
And of the CIA model, the only thing that they've really cared about is availability.
Well, yeah, we've talked about that. Yeah.
Yep.
But, again, communicating the message, it really comes down to the reason they don't care is because they're so busy, they don't have time for some big long-winded explanation, even if they don't understand it. It's about boiling it down and getting to the point.
Yeah.
Which I think is, again, and I said this earlier before, but I think is a challenge for a lot of us in this industry is there's just this absolute obsession with attack tactics. And it's like, let's analyze every infinitesimal zillions of billions of little, let's obsess over China, let's obsess over attackers. And it's not to say that that stuff isn't interesting. It is interesting. It's interesting to us. We think that's interesting. But the minute you go and talk to the board and say, ooh, China, and there's this guy and this thing, he does this, and you start blathering off all these sort of zillions of little attack tactics, executives just go, don't care, don't care, don't care, don't care, don't care. Get to the point, buddy. What is it going to cost us? What's the value to the business? I don't care about some, vulnerability you discovered in a protocol, blah, 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 attacker, Russian. Don't care. I want to know the answer that's going to protect our business. So
I'd just like to point out that in some of our, some risk assessments, even some of the ones that we've done pretty recently, there have been times where we've taken sort of abstruse, things like that, like threats that seem a little bit nebulous and all that, and we've been able to apply to some very specific instances, like, this nebulous threat that you think maybe you should possibly have been concerned about. Here's the way it's affecting you.
Your business, though. But
yeah, your
there's no point-
business.
Yeah.
This thing, in fact, the thing that you were complaining to us about while we were on site, yeah, you were right. That gut instinct you had that maybe there was something going on there, that is a problem for you.
Well, and I think one of the problems when we talk about communicating to leadership and getting the sponsorship that you need for the programs, whatever, is this focus on tactics has meant that that's also the solutions that companies wind up deploying. They get stuff designed to prevent certain specific attacks or classes of attacks, and they don't spend enough time developing their own strategy and structure that would have potentially negated, the need to focus on any specific tactics, right?
Sure, you're playing the whack-a-mole game with technology
exactly.
instead of focusing on security ops and processes for it. Right?
Well, if you have the defense in depth in the first place, then chances are some of these breaches that hit the news or some of these vulnerabilities that hit the news, watch out for this, it's going to kill your business. Like, well, it won't be a problem for us because we've got the structure in place to prevent it from being a big deal.
Let me just say one thing about defense in depth, because you mentioned this when you were talking about the different technologies and solutions. Something I've been hearing a little bit more recently is people asking me about certain classes of security technologies, saying, these are generally not effective, so why should I even bother? And I can't necessarily make a strong argument that AV is really super effective or IPS is a silver bullet, because it's not. This is, well known and understood. But that doesn't mean that you should not implement it, because the fact is they still have some level of effectiveness. They still provide some degree of visibility to the health of your network. And if you have appropriate security operations in place that you can monitor and maintain these systems, I still advocate that there is value to them, even, in fact, more value if you understand that having AV on the desktop is not simply enough, but it doesn't mean you don't have it.
Well, yeah, but we've seen the problem where companies, they say, well, AV doesn't work, so I'm going to go out and buy the most ludicrously expensively complicated security analytics platform in the history of mankind, and I'm going to put a 14-year-old, who just got a juvie hall in charge of this whole thing. And it's like you're buying like the most complicated thing. Yeah, I don't know where that came from either. You're buying this super complicated technology, and then you're putting it in the hands of completely incapable or it's like these high maturity technologies in low maturity environments. And it's like, as we always say, if you can't master antivirus and IPS, you are not ready for security analytics.
They've been listening to their salespeople, and they've tried to leapfrog all the low-level technologies that they've been told are no longer effective. We're going to go straight for the best technology. Right. We've been told this is the best technology.
Well, and the truth is, with AV stuff, AV does work. It just doesn't catch everything.
It doesn't work very well.
It's like a flu shot. You go get one because you don't want to get the flu and you don't want to put your family and everybody else in danger. Is it going to prevent you against every strain that's out there? No.
That's a great analogy.
Most of them.
Yeah, that is a good analogy.
Yeah,
no, I'm with you there.
All right. I feel like I keep bringing up the same topic. Like I said, you can tell where my scars are. So let's talk about threat intelligence and breach notification issues.
Well, this kind of goes back to your so what and what do I do?
Yeah.
And this is kind of the next level for everything we've talked about, both the breaches and the vulnerabilities, is what do we do?
What do we do?
And in the past, it's always been incumbent on the company, your little silo, your little world, to kind of figure out, okay, well, this is what happened and this is how we fix it. And so you've got everybody in every industry going around doing this. And in the past, there hasn't been any sharing of data. Nobody says, hey, this is common amongst all the banking industry, or this is common amongst all the retailers. And so everybody has been reinventing their own wheel over and over and over.
What do you guys think about this whole thing where the president, what is it you called it, the
ISAOs?
ISAOs.
It helped foster communication between government agencies and private sector and within private sectors to share threat information and breach information. And
what do you guys think of this?
I think it's necessary.
It's a step in the right direction for sure. I mean, the big challenge with gathering threat intelligence beyond your own little silo, as you say, is that instinctively people do not like to communicate their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses, and certainly not at an organizational level. So it's very difficult for security professionals to get together at some community meeting or whatever and say, we just got owned 6 ways to Sunday. Here's exactly how it happened. Heads up, competitors, you might want to try to mitigate.
Well, but it goes back to that reputational issue.
Right, because you don't want to admit.
People don't want to damage their own reputation by admitting this stuff.
Right. How much more damaging is it to come out and say, we had a problem, here's what we're doing to take care of it, than to wait until somebody else says, hey, my stuff was stolen from them. Yeah.
But the point is, if we could sanitize the exchange of threat information, which is what some of the ISACs that exist with the different industries and the
ISAO
that the Obama was talking about there, I think that's definitely a step in the right direction to try to mitigate that risk. Forget about whether or not it's more mature to come out, directly and say this was an issue and here's how we're going to try to mitigate it and contain it, and everything's under control here.
I'm going to be a little bit contrarian here.
Of course you are.
Which is that I think that these things are a great idea. that is going to be crippled by people's lack of trust in this, because what's happening is you're asking people to share information about the kinds of issues they've had, the kind of breaches they've had. You're asking them to share it with the government, who promises that they'll, that they won't, reveal it to anybody or whatever. Yeah, the government has a great track record of
Promise the NSA will never see it.
Well,
so,
but keep in mind, there's a difference between the one that the ISO that just came out and the ISACs have been out for quite a while. The ISACs were built up within their own industry for their own purposes. It is, most of them do charge membership, so it's not a free ride, and it has nothing to do with government. It has everything to do with the industry itself saying, hey, we need to share this information and do it in a way that doesn't threaten our own business.
So maybe other industries have been better about this. I know the financial industry had a real problem with that because financial companies don't trust each other. So they really didn't want to share that information.
But healthcare is a little bit more mature.
Well, sort of. In my experience, health organizations, a lot more than other industries, do interact with each other and share information. They have to because they share patients already. If you don't specialize in something, then you have to be able to send patients somewhere that does because it's best for the patient. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're quite as open with potential business risks and that kind of stuff as probably they should be.
So what are some of the alternatives, though, if you don't feel comfortable participating in one of these, threat intelligence exchanges at the...
Well, there's commercial threat intelligence. I mean, all of the, and this is actually a big thing that a lot of the vendors are going after right now. They're building these threat intelligence centers, right? And so if you look at some of the companies that are out there, I mean, the Bain just acquired Blue Coat, right? Well, Blue Coat's got a big threat intelligence center, right? Cisco's got one, and Symantec has one, and Palo Alto has one, and McAfee has one that sucks, and McAfee, we kid them. So all of these organizations have their own threat intelligence, and what would be really, really awesome is if those companies could start talking and sharing together. Now, there was something that happened about 6 months, maybe 4 months ago. Palo Alto and Fortinet actually started sharing data, which I thought was amazing because the two of them hate each other's guts. So the fact that they're actually sharing data now is I don't know, that was sort of reassuring. Now if we can get the McAfees and Symantecs and Cisco's and all these to start sharing their data across it. The problem is a lot of them right now are using their threat intelligence as a competitive. They're going into the market and saying, we have the best threat intelligence in the world. We update our data every. So one of the projects I've been involved with recently, the company was like, well, we update our data every 9 seconds, and it's like, so what? I mean, you could update it every 9 nanoseconds. It doesn't mean the data is useful. So I think that's the next question: is how valuable is this threat intelligence?
The commercial offerings.
Well, a lot of these companies also, one of the things that we want to make sure businesses avoid is falling into the trap of saying, okay, well, we're a Symantec customer. They send us all this information and assuming that what you're getting from them is all there is. These different companies that maintain these corporate threat intelligence groups, these people who go out and do this information, share it with their customers, but they don't necessarily all know the same things or receive the same alerts. And if you're, as a customer, just listening to the one that's coming from the company that you're already paying, you might be missing something too.
Well, and it's a good example of move, counter move. The black hats don't just go to one website to find vulnerabilities in companies.
That's a good point.
The darknet shares.
They don't?
The darknet shares this information. If a company's breached, you can go online, you can go to the darknet, and you go find out how that company's breached.
You just said something that's interesting, though. It's the hackers share better than the companies.
Absolutely.
Isn't that an interesting concept?
And we're just now starting through the ISACs and the rest of this. We're just now starting to catch up to that.
And they also allocate more resources.
Oh,
we're talking about this,
absolutely.
we talk about the breaches and the vulnerabilities and all of that that's going on there. I mean, to have, I don't like to focus on budget necessarily because I think the process is as important as anything. But at the end of the day, if you're spending $100K and your adversary is spending $1 million, then inevitably you're probably going to lose. And so I think there's a big delta there.
And especially beyond healthcare, if you're in the production environment where you're bringing things to market that have value, if whatever this widget is that's worth $5,000 or $5 million to your company, if somebody's willing to spend $10 million to get it, then you better spend $10 million to protect it, at least that much.
Or if what you think is very important is actually not of a high value to the company and you don't understand that, it's very easy to misallocate what limited resources you have too, which comes back to having a better understanding of the threat environment and the risks there.
But that's just it. I don't think they need to spend $10 million. I mean, you can break into an environment now with, I mean, that's just what we were talking about with the Anthem one, right? Is that you got 5 people. You don't need to spend $1 million to steal $5 million worth of data. You need to spend like $50.
Let me wrap this back around to something that Jordan was saying earlier. For a lot of these things, like, so let's say you've got all this great threat intelligence, right? That's being updated every 9 nanoseconds, you know? So you have like mountains of threat intelligence data, right? The trouble is, like, if you don't have an inventory of what you've got, you don't even know what applies to you.
Right.
I mean, it's just not very consumable by most organizations.
Yep.
I mean, you talk about needing a team of guys to run a SIM. I mean, having a bunch of threat intelligence feeds and chasing down every cloud-based IP address that was reallocated.
This looks like a horrifying threat. Do we have this thing in our environment?
Well, and to your point, Andrew, getting more data faster doesn't solve the problem. You still have to be able to analyze and deal with the data, you know.
It's actually something I said in the meeting. They were talking about how, well, we update every 9 seconds. And I'm like, so what? I mean, what? You know?
You add 100 guys.
That sounds like an impressive metric, but it isn't.
Right.
It sounds impressive to somebody who doesn't understand the scope of what you're updating. I'd rather have you update every 9 days with something valuable than to update every 9 seconds with you know.
So assuming you have access to threat intelligence data in some capacity, what are some of the solutions to make it more consumable and usable?
Well, it's interesting you bring that point up. That was the little clunky segue, but that's okay. So that is an interesting. There's an interesting thing going on in the industry right now, and this is where the technology space is getting. There's a lot of movement right now toward security analytics. This idea of how do you take a small team or even a single individual and empower them with a tool set that lets them basically cut through this data faster, quicker, and gives them really what it amounts to is a kind of a single pane of glass where in one place you can drill, cross drill, side drill, up and down drill, and you can go in and out of systems and you can really bring all that data into a common structure. And what I'm seeing right now as I go around and do some of this industry analysis stuff is that the security analytics market is I mean, that's where the future is for security technologies right now. And what's happening is that they're fusing, starting with like SIM and some of the basic technologies that are out there. They're trying to kind of bring more in them. So some people say this is kind of next gen SIM. I actually think this is beyond SIM. It's really SIM will be a piece of this whole, and the whole will be something that not only can ingest data from multiple sources. So we're talking about endpoint agents, network devices, threat intelligence feeds, SIM technologies, log data, packet data, you know, all this data coming up into one sort of framework, but then also the tools to not only manipulate that data, but then to affect change, then to actually impose policy down on the environment. And one of the interesting things that is developed out of this, and I just published a blog entry about this, is this the desktop, the endpoint is now back in play again. For years here, for the last few years, there's been this no more agents, nothing on the endpoint. We don't want anything on, you know, our desktop. You know, we've already got AV and IPS and, you know, maybe like app filtering or something like that. We don't want yet another agent. Well, the fact is that that's now going away because unless you are at the endpoint, you're just not going to see certain things. You just simply cannot see certain attacks at the network level. And, you know, the IPS vendors and the secure web gateway vendors for years and the next-gen firewall vendors have been trying to play this, you know, do it all at the network level, do it all at the network level. You don't need to be at the endpoint. It just doesn't work anymore. You have to be at the endpoint to see certain things. So this is a really formative market. It hasn't all come quite together yet. I think we're probably 18 months out before we'll see the first truly unified security analytics platforms. But you do have a few platforms that are kind of there. You have Blue Coat's Solera platform with their Norman Shark and their secure web gateway. You have RSA's platform, which is they can do the packet capture and the log data, but they can't really affect change. And so you've got a couple that are sort of there. IBM has started basically a whole new division around this, around their Q1, the Q1 acquisition that they made.
FireEye has some.
FireEye is trying to get into this space. Yeah, more or less. But you're also seeing the next-gen firewall vendors. So both Fortinet, Palo Alto, and Checkpoint all have made pretty significant, and Cisco/SourceFire, have all made pretty significant investments either in their endpoint product or in acquiring. So Palo Alto acquired Savera. Checkpoint just acquired Hyperwise, I think is the name. Cisco acquired SourceFire. And of course, Fortinet has their Forta client because they don't acquire anything. But anyways, they're making a lot of investment in these technologies and trying to unify them with the next-gen firewalls and the network devices.
Well, it's the same kind of stuff we saw with performance monitoring, maybe 10 years ago, where people were focusing on the availability, that you have all this data about what your systems are doing, and now you need to be able to do meaningful stuff with it. And security is getting to that point now too, and that's the whole idea, right? Is enabling these smaller teams to take meaningful action, and we're getting there.
I mean, the analytics platforms and concepts, the intent is to automate this to some degree, right?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of to automate it to some extent, but also it really comes down to a simple reality of our industry, which is that there's a very, very limited number of people who can do what we do, and it isn't growing that quickly, the number of people who can do this, because as all of us know who sat at this table, it took a long time to get where we are. I mean, all of us kind of had to come up from the ground up, whether it was through system admin or network admin or in my case as a tech writer. We all kind of had to start at the ground where, because you have to. In order to get into security, you can't just take a college class and then call yourself a security guy. You've got to sort of work your way into it for a while. Yeah, well, you can. You get very good security.
We're still to the point. There's no substitute for experience. There just really isn't.
Right. And the problem is, let's face it, there isn't. I mean, when I started this company in '95, nobody did this. Nobody. I mean, I couldn't get anybody to even talk about security. They would like, what? I mean, they just sort of roll your eyes. It wasn't even until the early 2000s that people even comprehended what, computer security was. And I would say it's only really been until the last few years that information security, cybersecurity, whatever word you want to use, has really now risen to the board level. Up until this, it's still been kind of down in the trenches with the IT guys. Now it's at the board level. Now it's actually getting real serious attention. And the technologies are shifting to really fit that sort of mindset, which among a lot of executives, there is this mindset of, I can't hire a team of 58 guys.
Right.
It's just not going to happen. So how do I take what I have and make better use out of it?
Well, and there's things companies can do now to prepare for some of these security analytics technologies that are coming down the road, making sure that you have systems that are capable of feeding data somewhere else, firewalls that can send information into log aggregators or intelligence systems or whatever, right? Not buying stuff or not, this gets a little bit into the product thing of it, but trying to avoid solutions that have proprietary, if you get our solution, you have to use our stuff to look at, even see the data, right? Well, what if they're not so good at analyzing the data as somebody else? Then what do you do?
What it really comes down to is that you have to keep any technology, and I say this to people all the time, whenever you look at a technology, you're buying the future, you're not buying the present. You have to constantly be kind of looking out into the future to see where it goes. And when it comes down to vendors, the challenge with a lot of these vendors is they always want to sell you what they have today. They always want to tell you about what they have today. We have got this, we've got that. Frankly, I think my advice to almost everybody I talk to is don't ask them about what they do today. Ask them about what they're going to do in a year. And if they can't describe their roadmap to you, and that roadmap doesn't sound pretty interesting, I wouldn't even talk to that vendor, because the roadmap is almost more important. Where they're going is more important than where they are, because where they're going shows how innovative and how kind of in tune with things they are, versus companies that maybe they have something that isn't bad today, but is it going to be a piece of garbage in a year or 18 months from now?
On the flip side, though, I would just say that if you are talking to vendors about some specific product, sometimes what they're saying the product actually does is their roadmap.
Right? Yeah.
Particularly when you're talking about some of these more emergent technologies in the analytics space and threat detection and everything else. So
Wait, they sell you a product like, oh, that does all that? Well, not now.
yeah, but it will. It will.
Which is great, and that's good to know. But again, you're right. You need to know whether it does it now or whether it will do it later.
Also, I think what I'm hearing from what you're saying there is that these emergent technologies, they're going to drop into place much better in like a well-run, matured security operational program, rather than just like, if you've got a program that's in shambles, you'll just drop this thing in and it'll plug and play and you'll be done. It sounds like you really want to prepare your security program by being kind of up and running and having good inventory of what you've got and doing good operational procedures
But it's what we see all
already,
the time.
and then those will plug in well.
We
So
see
the
this all
tool
the
you
you choose should fit in with your security processes and model. You shouldn't try to build a security process around a tool.
Right there.
That's
Good,
great
great,
point.
great way to
Thank
put
you,
it.
James.
As always, James. It's right to the point.
And we shouldn't lose focus on new toy, the bright shiny thing.
Right.
We still see a lot of places that they're having a hard time getting the basics.
Yeah, they can't communicate the effectiveness of their patch management, yet they're looking at some type of security analytics platform, which they don't have the people to run, they don't have the budget to maintain,
Right.
and they're not even doing some of the basics effectively.
Well,
Yeah.
security
I
analytics,
mean-
even some whoop-de-doo solution that somebody sells you is not going to give you or create a security program for you.
Right.
That's
So, great.
for sure.
You have a network tap now on your edge that's taking full packet captures, and you have, gigabytes of data sitting somewhere that you could analyze through a dashboard maybe. What are you really going to do with that?
But
Right.
you haven't hardened your workstation. You got
Yeah.
you know,
Patch
you still,
management.
you still have to do the basics. And the basics, that's the hard work. That's the heavy lifting. Once you've got all of that in place, plugging in analytics is going to be a hell of a lot
Problem is,
easier and of value.
Nobody's going to take you out to an expensive lunch to sell you basics.
No.
That's
The basics aren't interesting. They're not
They're
sexy.
boring.
They're not cool, and they
They're
don't
not
get the
cool.
news.
Nobody likes them. You're never going to get a free
Yeah.
lunch off of the basics.
Yeah.
And the fact is that that's why. I mean, that's why we say, the vendors will pollute the process. I mean, once they get in there and they start twisting you and getting you into this, shiny object syndrome, you're always just kind of going after the next new glorious thing.
And it's really social engineering at its finest, right? I mean, everybody likes
Yeah,
new stuff.
absolutely.
So you're saying now that vendors and bars are basically social engineering?
Vendors are
pretty
part of the
obvious
dark
that
hats.
Anitian, we're pretty down on bars and vendors.
No, but
Our scars run deep
let
here.
me say this thing that you were talking when we were talking about the resource constraints from a personnel perspective. There are vendors and solutions that are out there. You talk about, I don't have the resources to buy a 58-person team of, security analysts. You probably couldn't recruit those people even if you did have the resources.
Yeah.
So there's that problem too. And so for that reason, and because our industry is somewhat limited, I have seen a growth of more of these monitoring services that are out there. So I definitely think there's options. I just think this gets back to the whole issue we talked about with some of the breaches and other things, is having good, robust service provider risk management programs to really understand who you're engaging with, what you're trusting them to do, what your expectations are, and being able to demonstrate some level of due diligence.
Even your security provider.
Even your security provider, just because they say they are doesn't necessarily mean that what they're providing is legitimately protected.
Well, that due diligence applies to the ongoing maintenance topics too. You can look at all this next shiny and you can go and implement whatever the latest and greatest absolute thing is, but if you're not going back to your older systems and updating them and taking care of them and doing the care and feeding and stuff that would have patched these vulnerabilities that are coming out, those last couple of SSL vulnerabilities were fixed in prior versions or fixed right away, but if you don't have a process of updating the stuff that you have, you're still vulnerable as old things regardless of whatever new shiny thing you plugged in front of it.
Yeah, right. You spend all your time tuning your SIM, and it tells you, hey, you're getting known like crazy with all the vulnerabilities you hadn't been patching in the last 3 months.
So one of the SSL vulnerabilities was nicknamed the bar mitzvah vulnerability because it's been around for 13 years.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yes.
Oh, 13 years.
Yep.
But it just goes to show there's certain things that are going to be out of your control, which is why you need to have good vulnerability management, security ops, and defense in depth. I mean,
It's interesting you say that, because that's exactly the problem is that the fact that there's an SSL vulnerability that's been around for 13 years, that's out of your control. You can't do squat about that. You're not going to completely rewrite the entire internet because you're pissed off that there's this vulnerability out there. And that's the problem with a lot of security guys. It's like, can you believe it? There's been a vulnerability for 13 years. What are we going to do about this? We're going to do Nothing, because there's nothing you can do about that. It's been around for 13 years. What you're going to do is you're going to go back to focusing on protecting your environment, on building defense in depth, on patching. But that isn't exciting and fun, and I can't froth about that like
But
an
it
insane
prepares
word
your
for an hour.
organization
It doesn't
to
sell
deal
hardware.
with
It
it.
doesn't sell any hardware.
It's the same with, we didn't really talk about it, but there was the Superfish and some of these other firmware attacks. And at the end of the day, as a security professional protecting your organization, there is very little you can do to actually mitigate the risk of some OEM getting hacked and having their firmware injected before you procure it. But you certainly can do things to protect your infrastructure in the event that you do get some type of malware coming in through that vector.
If you need to protect the information that flows through your business, then you need to make sure that you can adapt to those kind of things and deal with it.
I
Right?
do think
limit the exposure.
I do
That's
think
a good point. It's like the firmware hacking, which I'm a firm believer that pretty much a lot of the laptops and devices you get now have malware directly embedded or in the
They call it value-added software now.
Yeah. I mean, it's because, let's face it, we've seen these manufacturing environments, and the truth is that they're very extremely poorly secured, which it would not be terribly difficult to just put the code put the malware directly into the code or inject it right at the manufacturing process. So that much being said, but again, it kind of comes to that, okay, we all accept that as a reality. What are we going to do about it? There's nothing you can do about it, at least in terms of you're not going to stop that from happening. What you're going to do is you're going to protect yourself. You're going to, that exists. You're going to go back to the basics of the patch management, the formatting drives, that kind of stuff. You're going to go back to that boring stuff. It's the same principle with, the Chinese are hacking us. What are we going to do about it? You're going to do nothing because there really is nothing. You're not going to go to war with China over this. It's not going to happen. Right. And it doesn't matter how much you froth about it and how angry you get about it. You're not going to stop it. So, but you're not going to stop crime is what it comes down to.
Right. You need to be prepared to deal with it when it happens. You can't leave. Right. This is like the same discussion we have with folks when we talk about like backup and disaster recovery programs. And a lot of organizations, that's one of the last thing IT focuses on after they get everything up and running and make sure it's going to be running. It really shouldn't be the last thing you focus. And that applies to security, incident response as well. This shouldn't be an afterthought. Yeah. You need to be prepared to deal with an event when and if it happens, because the impact of the event is
and it really doesn't matter whether it comes from China or a 13-year-old SSL vulnerability. You should basically have a program that can manage any one of those. It shouldn't be like
the known unknowns and all the unknown unknowns, right?
Yeah. Well, Jordan, that was actually a good point, because if you're in the middle of a disaster recovery or incident response, it's too late to try to draft all your responses.
Right.
You can't develop that program in the middle of responding to it.
Yeah. We're at the end of our time, actually. We've hit our time. So I think we hit the few questions we got. If any of you do have any additional questions at this point, or comments or concerns or anything, please feel free to share them with us. We're going to go ahead and wrap at this point. And I want to thank all of you for attending today. I want to thank our panelists for participating, of course. I think this was lively and exciting and fun. And we will do this again next quarter. We do these at the end of each quarter, so look for our next one sometime in June, I guess, the end of June. We'll be doing our next roundtable. We'll also have some other upcoming webinars and other events as well. If any of you are going to be attending RSA, please feel free to check in on our event. Anitian will be doing an event on Wednesday night at the Jamber Pub. And if you want to know any information, just shoot us an email. We're happy to let you know about it. You can come by and meet some of the team and hang out with us and have fun at RSA. So for everybody, thank you again for coming. Thank you for attending, and have a great day.